Sir Keir Starmer, KC, he is a believer in the supremacy of lawyers, rules which are enforced by people like him and prevent anybody else from having a say in anything. It's profoundly undemocratic. It is an endeavour to create a one-party state. What's needed is for the little people to take new control of politics.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and I'm delighted to welcome David Starkey. David will need absolutely no introduction to most of you at home. He is one of the UK's most eminent historians and most combative TV broadcasters as well.
A thug. An intellectual thug.
An intellectual thug.
Let's get it right.
So, David, I wanted to talk to you about the new Labour government that we currently find ourselves living under.
Change
Get
Labour. Your language right. It's
I mean
Labour.
new, not as in capital N, new, but new as in coming in now. A lot of people talk about Keir Starmer as being a moderate. They look at the Labour manifesto and say that it was very thin, very light on promises. But you've argued that actually Labour's programme is a lot more substantial and perhaps a lot more worrying than a lot of people have been led to believe.
You asked me two questions, one about Starmer, the other about the programme. Let's begin with Starmer. Starmer, as the Baldwin biography makes clear, has fundamental and indeed fundamentalist beliefs. He is a believer in the supremacy of law. That doesn't actually mean the supremacy of law. It means the supremacy of lawyers, of people like him. He believes that basically human society should be constructed according to rules made by people like him, which are enforced by people like him, and prevent anybody else who is not like him from having a say in anything. That's where we are. And it's through the device of this strange thing called human rights law. Now, when Labour sort of pinned its colours to the mast, we are, unlike the wicked Conservatives who were thinking about repealing the European Convention, or the incorporation of the European Convention into English law, we are committed to it, just as Churchill was. The important thing to remember is, since Churchill, in European terms, and since Eleanor Roosevelt, in terms of the Universal Declaration, did their work, human rights have been stood on their head. This is the key to understanding what's gone wrong. Originally, human rights were to protect the rights of you and me against the state. They were there to make sure there wasn't another fascism, there wasn't another Nazism, and if possible, there wasn't another communism. That's what they were there for. Subsequently, they've been perverted. There's been an Orwellian inversion, and instead of the human rights of everybody, you and me, to have freedom of speech, political participation and whatever, human rights have become the rights of minorities against the majority. And what the only person, the only thing, the only, as it were, personal entity, in the sense of a corporate person that can enforce the rights of minorities against the majority is the state. Yeah. So human rights have absolutely stood on their head. So they have become deliberately anti-populist. They've become anti-democratic. And Starmer, can we give him his proper title? Sir Keir Starmer, KCMG, with a pension so gigantic that it requires a separate act of parliament to protect it, represents this. And everything that Labour does, everything he does, everything that it will do, embodies a particular view of society, and the view that this, have you noticed the language? Public service. Yeah. This mysterious thing. What it really means, it's a bit like human rights or the rule of law. It means the rule of public servants like him, except they're not servants. They're masters. They're a new ruling class. The Labour Party has stood on its head. It's no longer the party, dear me, the working class, these awful people, in the north of England who, a bit patriotic, occasionally wave the Union Jack, and still worse, they sometimes, I can't really mention it politely, they wave St. George's Cross, The Labour Party abominates these people. Yeah. What it actually represents is the public sector, the public white-collar sector, the public sector trade unions, and the whole of the new academic quangocracy. So it's become, very remarkably, it's become the party of the new ruling class.
And crucially, all of the centres of power there that you've talked about, whether it's the courts, the civil service, or what have you, they are all outside of Parliament.
They are deliberately non-democratic. They're deliberately not subject to any form of parliamentary control. And this is bizarrely regarded as a good thing. And again, just I talked about Starmer and sort of elided from that to what I think his general political position is. If we look at what New Labour is in, Change Labour, Renewed Labour is intending to do, it is to take forward this process which was developed so profoundly under New Labour, under Blair, and more particularly Brown, when you create the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, which determines interest rates, when you create the Climate Change Committee, when you create a Supreme Court. In other words, the first two things are quangos that remove the most important areas of public policy from direct parliamentary oversight. Then you create a Supreme Court, a Supreme Court against a sovereign parliament. Hence the fact we've been in a state of semi-constitutional crisis ever since, with things like the prorogation business. Yeah. And then finally, and most destructively, the importation of this human rights doctrine. And remember, there's a bigger thing than what I was talking about before, than this is the basis of a new ruling class. The very idea of universal human rights suggests there's a body above the state. I mean, human rights laws don't owe their power to the fact they're enacted by Parliament. They have some mysterious, ethereal, it's quasi-religious. And indeed, I think it's a perversion of Christianity. It's a perversion of the Magnificat. He shall pull down the mighty from their seats and exalt them of low degree. Literally, that's what it is. And then finally, again, this strange inversion of language. So natural rights become the rights only of minorities against the majority. But again, the final thing was the Equality Act. It sounds wonderful, cuddly, but it's the Inequality Act. It's the new Apartheid Act, because it privileges a whole series of minorities against the majority. Hence the fact that diversity, equality and inclusion, equity and inclusion actually becomes an exercise of eliminating as many white men as possible.
And that's going to be accelerated in Labour's Race Equality Act.
Everything.
And in terms of some of this agenda, I suppose the effect is to embed the Labour Party's view of the world into the law, to make it practically unchangeable for, say, another government, whether it's the Conservatives or a populist.
I think that is the general intention, and that is undoubted. What Keir Starmer's basic ambition is to so change the law that the social changes, the changes of intellectual and legal atmosphere of the 1990s and the early 2000s are irreversible. That is, it's profoundly undemocratic. It is, in fact, let's use proper words. It is an endeavour to create a one-party state.
Yeah.
And this is, again, on the basis of a constitution which has conceded this power on the basis of 1/3 of those who actually voted and 1/5 of the electorate. We need to remind ourselves. Yeah. Now, I think, in one sense, it's infinitely alarming. In another sense, I think it's such an absurd enterprise. And so intellectually chaotic. Yeah. Again, the whole notion that you're going hell for leather for growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, setting up an alphabet soup of regulatory bodies and nationalised industries is the tension is obvious. It's already quite clear that there's a fundamental tension between economic growth and environmentalism and net zero. Again, the idea that you waste, admittedly, it's only the odd 8 billion. What's that between friends? That's going to go into Great British Energy, but that's money that could actually go into something real, like building proper transport links in the north.
And also they're banning, offshore drilling and things like that. So
the whole thing is deranged, but it's logically contradictory.
Yeah.
But again, you see, it seems to me that the whole position of the left, wherever you look at it, is a denial of reality. In the same way, it's essentially religious. So you believe in net zero. You announce, these extraordinary targets that we're going to have, as it were, fossil-free electricity by 2030. Everybody tells them it's completely impossible. But no, to say you want a fossil-free electricity by 2030 is exactly the equivalent of believing in the second coming of Christ. We know one of them is absolutely lunatic. We keep quiet about the other. And I think this is, again, something very striking about the left's, as it were, monopoly of language or quest for a monopoly of language. If you know your Alice in Wonderland, which seems to me to be the key text of New Labour, the Red Queen requires you to believe 5 impossible things before breakfast. Yeah. And under some circumstances, a man can have a cervix. So I think he can acquire one, can't he? Wasn't that the
David Lammy's view,
sort of grow one
with enough hormones?
Yes.
And it's Humpty Dumpty who says that words mean just what exactly what I want them
again in I think it's Through the Looking Glass, isn't it? Words mean exactly what I want them to mean, neither more nor less. And he uses again the phrase, it's a matter of power.
Yeah.
This is the most dangerous thing about what's going on. It's the perversion of language. It's exactly, again, Orwell foresaw it all. He understood completely that the left proceeds by the manipulation of reality and, above all, the manipulation of language.
And sticking with the theme of language, I think the day we're speaking, Labour has put out a sort of opening salvo in their war on free speech. They've announced their intention to scrap the Higher Education Free Speech Bill for universities. We know that they have some other plans for curtailing free speech. What do you make of that side of things? What does it mean for civil liberties?
I think it's entirely predictable. I mean, let me take my own case. You will remember I had an incident where the tongue slipped, as it tends to when you say too many things as I do. There were two stages in that business. There was the initial hysterical reaction of the 30th of June, the 1st of July 2020, and cancellation and whatever. And then a few months later in October, there was a particularly insane policeman. And he decided, myself and poor little Darren Grimes, had committed an offence under under Section 6, I think it is, of the Public Order Act, which carries sentences of up to 6 years. Wow. Now, even the Times, that was not very sympathetic, wrote a third leader saying, this is mad. Grimes should hold his head in shame and Starkey should retire, and whatever. And the one public figure supported that charge. Who was it?
I can't remember.
Sir Keir Starmer,
of course,
ex-DPP. And remember, this is the most terrifying thing about them. This is where they are a real, genuine and urgent and dangerous threat. Starmer himself sees himself essentially as a prosecutor.
Yeah.
The role that he adopted, the role that he made his own, was that of DPP. Again, it's worth being quite clear about the sort of civil servants they've recruited. Sue Gray was the head. She was the one who invented this extraordinary thing in the Cabinet Office called propriety and ethics. Get it right, not ethics, ethics. And do you know what it's used as? It's used as a modern Stasi. I know I've been at the receiving end of it. This again, we all need to understand this, and I am now going to look straight at camera. We have, in the heart of our government, an organisation doing exactly what Coutts Bank did to Nigel Farage. It keeps records on you. It notes your activity on social media. It looks at comments that are made on you on social media. It takes anonymous accusations and it compiles files against you. We in Britain have that. That is something which was at the heart of the, as it were, the whole regulatory enterprise. Sue Gray was more or less the inventor of it, which is why she is labelled by Oliver Letwin as the key figure in government. Yeah. This is nothing to do with policy. It is to do with the deliberate regulation of speech.
And Spiked was also caught up in
You
one
were
of those.
caught up in it too.
Our files have been on there.
And so we all need to understand this. I mean, again, I'm going to do a little bit of propaganda here too. All of us should join the Free Speech Union. It's going to be the only thing that stands between most of us and jail.
So it's not just Sue Gray who we should worry about in Starmer's top team. There's also Ollie Robbins. Most people will know him as the Brexit negotiator under Theresa May, but actually he has perhaps more worrying things that, in his past that should concern us.
A complete Secret Service background. In the Treasury, he was actually in charge of the funding of the Secret Service. And his most recent occupation has been with this extraordinary thing called Hackloit, which is an assembly of former MI6 agents in London, running now as some sort of security consultancy or something in Mayfair. I mean, there's a real. Again, it sounds mad. It sounds as though I'm subscribing to conspiracist theories, but there's a real sense of, for the first time, overtly, a machinery of repression being created. But you see, I don't think there's anything surprising about this. Starmer, Sue Gray, I'm sure Robbins, all think they're engaged in doing good.
Yeah.
They're not wicked. In the same way that the people who tortured and burned people alive in the Spanish Inquisition thought they were doing good because they believe there is only one version of the truth, which is the one they possess. Those of us on the right know there isn't one version of the truth. We know that human beings are profoundly flawed. We know that the last thing government should try to do is to make people perfect. You acknowledge the fact that we are, we don't only have feet of clay, we have all sorts of other mentionable things of clay as well. And you accommodate social policy to that. You also recognize that the whole way in which the West has developed, I know it's again intolerable to say why the West is superior to any other civilization, because it's a civilization which depended on debate. It depended on challenge. It depended on arguments being based in reality, this thing you can hit, this thing you can touch. But the left don't want that because they're religious.
And in terms of sort of recovering democracy from the sort of Starmerite project, we still have a lot to recover from New Labour, I guess. Do the opposition, whether that's Conservatives or Reform or any other sort of populist challenges, are any of them up to the task of that?
Not yet. Not remotely. I mean, I think the first thing that's got to happen is to recognise the problem. Okay, you get Nigel Farage saying we want a referendum on the incorporation of the European Convention, but that's only the beginning. I mean, I think that the current debate, and it's a wise decision, I think, of the Conservative Party to have an extended leadership election, because at least what's gone wrong can be debated and some notion of putting it right. But it seems to me the first thing that's got to happen is what happened to the Conservative Party 50 years ago. Again, I remember this vividly. We're in 1974. The Conservative Party experienced in 1974 a shattering defeat when Edward Heath went to the country saying, "Who governs England?" And the answer came back, "Not you." And Harold Wilson was returned. Now, that led to an extraordinary moment of Damascene conversion by one of the key figures in our 20th century political history, Keith Joseph. Keith Joseph had been a lifelong Conservative, he'd been a minister under Heath, and yet he wakened up more or less the morning after the election, read his Friedrich Hayek, and suddenly realized, I've called myself a Conservative. I've been a minister in a Conservative government, but I have not been a Conservative, and the government wasn't Conservative either. And then he begins this extraordinary process of an intellectual reinvigoration. They, of course, are very lucky. They actually have come up with Thatcher immediately. Not that anybody thought she was any good at the time. She looked like a mere interim interim leader, but she actually turned out to have all the things you need in a prime minister, that astonishing will, the intelligence, the ability to grasp at big ideas, but also to handle tiny detail, all of those things that have been absolutely lacking in every prime minister ever since, with the partial exception of Tony Blair. So they were very, very lucky. But it's that redefinition of conservatism after a period when, to use rather cruel language, it had been polluted. From the Second World War onwards, conservatism was really sort of statist socialism. Remember, the British state that it emerges in 1945 is a product of war. And there'd been a wartime coalition. And although Churchill had done all the big bow wow of war and diplomacy, the home front had been very, very much left to Ernie Bevan, who was the General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union. And he and Attlee drive the domestic agenda. Again, the Army Education Corps drives a particular statist, socialist, gentleman in Whitehall knows best. And the Conservative Party was completely hooked on that from 45 onwards until 79. Well, I think something very similar happened with Blair. And this is the catastrophe of Cameron, it's the catastrophe of Osborne, it's the treble catastrophe of Michael Gove. They all absorb Blair. I mean, if you read, I've had the terrible misfortune to phrase it's an awful experience, but if you actually read Cameron's speeches in 2005, this is a Conservative Party that is a natural home for Liberal Democrats. He actually says that.
Yeah, and the heir to Blair.
And the heir to Blair. Well, that's him, but more particularly, that's Michael Gove. Gove in 2010 hands round marked up copies of Blair's memoirs as the new Machiavelli, and this is how to do government. You know, just jaw-dropping. And clearly, Osborne is a chancellor in the same kind of perpetually fiddling variety of Gordon Brown, destroying that wonderful simplification of tax and whatever, which had been brought in by Nigel Lawson.
But that is there a danger that is the vein of the Conservative Party that is not necessarily in the ascendancy, but still feels like it has the grip over at least the party in Westminster, if not the grassroots or the public?
It certainly doesn't have the grassroots. I mean, it has had dominance in Westminster. It's particularly, and this again, it's a terrible, really, Fraser, I hear the words coming out of my mouth and I think, what will people think has happened to Starkey? Nadine Dorris was probably right. It's an awful. You can really see that this is a Biden-esque moment. But I think broadly that picture of an inner group in CCHQ is right. But even they, I think, are beginning to realise that the signal is Tugendhat, who was absolutely central to that position of the party in his leadership bid, played around, though not very convincingly, with the withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights. There's a dawning realization. And there are individuals that I would very much support in the leadership bid, particularly Robert Jenrick. He began, that cruel nickname, generic, he began as the absolutely typical, popped out of some sort of Brave New World machine, generating the typical centrist Tory MP. And then, very impressively, he became a government minister. He hit against the hard reality of the Channel boats. And you know what? He changed his mind. He did exactly what Maynard Keynes said. When the facts change, I change my mind, don't you? He changed his mind. He realized there would have to be not simply a derogation from the European Convention on Human Rights. You would actually either have to derogate from or radically revise the Convention on Refugees. He understood that. Now, that's exactly the sort of self-examination that's needed.
Yeah. And finally, for people at home, for people who aren't necessarily in the political class involved in the machinations of government, what is there any advice you'd give to them as to what to do, what needs to be understood to, turn back the tide against some of these developments?
What we need essentially is, and phrase, it's essentially an exercise of self-education. What's gone wrong is we have been treated with contempt by our political masters. The whole way in which the political class responded to the referendum was these little people have taken a decision which is vastly above them. We must suppress it and change it, and above all make sure that it never ever happens again. What's needed is for the little people to take new control of politics. We have the opportunity. Until they actually abolish elections, we can throw them out. But it requires a process of self-education, of debate, of finding other like-minded people, of above all being able to take the left on. The left is not serious. The ideas of woke are trash. They're intellectually preposterous. The only reason that they command assent, they don't command assent, the only reason they command submission is because people are frightened. There's got to be courage. I am very old-fashioned. I'm not exactly Andrew Tate. I don't go to the gym enough. But I do believe in that central masculine virtue of courage. No other virtue matters without courage, because they all become broken-backed.
David Starkey, thank you very much.
A pleasure.